The apartment was everything Charlotte had been looking for. Situated in a quiet, tree-lined street in the middle of the city, it was the perfect blend of peace and convenience. The old building had charm: creaky floors, a distinct smell of aged wood, and antique fixtures that made her feel like she was living in a place with history. The rent was affordable, and the landlord, a man named Mr. Farrow, seemed kind enough, though a little distant. When Charlotte first stepped inside, she was taken by the light that poured in through the large windows of the living room. The sun would shine directly through in the mornings, warming the faded hardwood floors. The space felt like it could become a home. The apartment was small, only one bedroom, but she didn't mind. She liked the simplicity. The kitchen was tucked to the side, with a small dining nook by the window, a perfect place for one person. But then there was the room at the back of the apartment, the one she hadn't noticed during her first tour. Mr. Farrow hadn't mentioned it. At first, Charlotte thought it was some kind of storage closet or perhaps an extra utility room. It had a door like any other, though it was tucked behind a heavy curtain, almost as if it had been deliberately concealed. She hadn't given it much thought at first, too eager to move in and start her new life. But once she began unpacking, she found herself drawn to it. The door had no handle on the outside. Instead, there was a small metal latch. The latch seemed odd, like something out of an old horror movie. It didn't make sense for a door to have no handle, not in an apartment that was otherwise perfectly functional. But still, Charlotte didn't think much of it. She figured it was just part of the building's antiquated design. She made a mental note to ask Mr. Farrow about it the next time she saw him. The first few days in the apartment went by smoothly, nothing out of the ordinary. But then she started feeling strange. At first, it was nothing more than an odd sensation, a vague discomfort that she couldn't quite place. Sometimes, when she was in the living room, she'd catch herself feeling faint, as if the room was pressing down on her. But she dismissed it as the stress of moving in, the anxiety of a new place. But then there were the headaches. They were dull at first, like the pressure of something heavy sitting on her temples. She tried to ignore them, but they grew worse with each passing day. By the end of the week, Charlotte couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The headaches had become constant, a deep, throbbing pain that followed her everywhere she went. The fatigue was relentless, weighing her down as if someone had placed a thick blanket of exhaustion over her shoulders. Still, she pushed forward. She was determined to make this apartment her home. Then came the dreams. They started slowly, just fragmented images. She saw shadows in the corners of her vision, fleeting figures that would vanish the moment she tried to focus on them. But the dreams escalated, becoming more vivid and terrifying. She was in that back room, the one she had never dared open. The air was thick, heavy with an oppressive, suffocating presence. The shadows in the room would move, inching closer to her with every breath she took. And in those dreams, she felt as though she couldn't move, trapped in some unseen force. The more she fought, the more the room seemed to press in on her, closing off any escape. Charlotte tried to ignore the dreams, chalking them up to stress. But they didn't stop. If anything, they grew worse. She began to notice strange things happening in the apartment when she was awake. It started with small noises, a creak in the floorboards, a whisper from the other side of the walls. At first, she thought it was just the building settling, the usual sounds of an old structure adjusting to the temperature changes. But then she began to hear something more distinct. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, as if someone were pacing back and forth in the hallway just outside her bedroom door. She was alone in the apartment. But still, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. It was always just out of her reach, a presence she couldn't explain. And then came the smell, a faint odor at first, like mildew or something damp. But it wasn't coming from the bathroom nor the kitchen. It seemed to linger in the air, seeping from the cracks in the walls. And the longer she stayed in the apartment, the more the smell grew. It became a thick, cloying stench that stuck to her clothes and hair, a pungent odor that refused to dissipate no matter how much she cleaned. One evening, after another restless night filled with disjointed dreams, Charlotte found herself standing in front of the door to the back room. She had told herself for days that she would leave it alone, but something drew her in, some primal curiosity she couldn't ignore. She reached for the latch. The cold metal felt unnaturally heavy in her hand. For a moment, she hesitated. She wasn't sure what she expected to find behind the door, but she knew, deep down, that it wasn't going to be good. With a quick twist of her wrist, she lifted the latch. The door creaked open, and the darkness beyond seemed to swallow the light of the hallway. She felt the hair on the back of her neck rise as she stepped inside. The room was small, smaller than she had imagined. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper. The yellowed patterns faded and warped. But what struck her most was the air in the room. It was heavy, like the weight of 1,000 years had settled there, pressing down on her chest. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, and the only sound was the faint whisper of her breathing. As she stepped further into the room, she felt the floor groan beneath her feet. It was as if the building itself was warning her to leave, but Charlotte couldn't move. She was rooted to the spot, drawn deeper into the room by an invisible force. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it, a figure standing motionless in the far corner of the room. The figure was cloaked in shadows, its form indistinct, but Charlotte could feel its presence. She wanted to scream, to run, but the air seemed to constrict around her, tightening her chest, choking her. The figure remained still, but it was as if it was watching her, waiting for something. She finally managed to tear her eyes away from the figure and turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind her. She spun around, heart racing. The figure was gone, but the room felt even darker, even more oppressive than before. Charlotte backed away, desperate to get out, but the walls felt closer now, as if they were slowly creeping in on her. She reached for the door, but it was no use. The walls were pushing in, squeezing her from all sides. The room was shrinking, and she couldn't escape. Her breath quickened. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and she could feel the pressure building in her chest. Panic took over, but the walls kept coming, pushing, closing in. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. The room was no longer just a room. It was a trap. The last thing Charlotte remembered before everything went black was the sound of the walls scraping together, the terrible grinding noise of the apartment closing in on her. The following days after Charlotte had entered the back room left her disoriented, her thoughts clouded, her movements sluggish. It was as if the room itself had left a permanent mark on her, something invisible yet undeniable, spreading like a sickness through her veins. She spent most of her days in the apartment now, rarely going outside. There was something about the world beyond that felt distant, foreign, as though her life had been replaced with the oppressive atmosphere of this place. The room had changed her, infected her mind in a way she couldn't explain. She woke every morning feeling more exhausted than when she had gone to bed, as though her body was fighting against some invisible force. The headaches never stopped. They hammered at the back of her skull, a dull rhythmic pounding that seemed to come from deep within the walls themselves. She couldn't escape them, no matter what she did. The medicine barely helped, and even that seemed to lose its effectiveness over time. The air felt thick and suffocating, as though the very atmosphere in the apartment had become dense with something unnatural. She had tried opening the windows to let in fresh air, but the scent of mildew and rot lingered stubbornly no matter the time of day. The smell was worse now, so foul and acrid that it made her stomach turn. She couldn't seem to escape it even when she moved from room to room. It clung to her clothes, to her skin. She could even taste it in the back of her throat, a constant reminder of whatever was festering within the walls of the apartment. Charlotte began to avoid the back room, though she couldn't fully ignore it. Every time she passed the door, she felt a chill in the air, a sense of unease that washed over her like a cold wave. But the door was always latched, always shut tight, as though something was trying to keep it hidden. She hadn't dared to open it again after that first time. The figure in the corner of the room had unsettled her more than she cared to admit. In her weaker moments, she wondered if she had imagined it. Perhaps it had been a trick of the light, the shadows playing tricks on her mind. But the feeling lingered, the sense that something was in that room, watching her. She couldn't shake the image of it, the outline of the figure standing motionless in the corner, just out of sight, but always present. As the days went on, the nightmares grew worse. The dreams weren't just confined to the back room anymore. They followed her, seeping into her waking hours, distorting the world around her. She would be standing in the kitchen, chopping vegetables, when the walls would begin to ripple like a liquid surface, stretching and bending in unnatural ways. She'd blink, and suddenly the walls would be alive with movement, shadows, figures, faces that would disappear the moment she looked directly at them. Charlotte knew something was wrong, but she didn't know what to do. She didn't want to tell anyone about the strange things happening in the apartment, didn't want to appear paranoid or crazy. She'd convinced herself that it was just the stress of the move, the weight of being in a new place, that was causing her to feel unwell, but it was becoming harder and harder to ignore. The whispers in the walls grew louder each night, faint murmurs that she couldn't make out. It was as if the apartment was trying to speak to her, to communicate something she wasn't ready to hear. She began avoiding the apartment as much as possible. Whenever she could, she'd take long walks. Even though the city outside felt like an alien landscape to her now, she felt disconnected from the world, like she no longer belonged in it. The sun, the sky, the streets, it all felt distant, unreachable, like she was viewing them from behind a thick veil. She'd wander through the parks, looking at the people around her, wondering if they too felt what she was feeling, if they too carried some invisible weight. The few friends she had made in the city began to notice the changes in her. She'd often cancel plans. Her energy levels always too low to meet them for coffee or a movie. They commented on how pale she looked, how her skin had become almost translucent, as though she hadn't seen the sun in weeks. But she couldn't bring herself to explain. She couldn't bring herself to tell them about the back room, about the things she had seen and felt. She didn't know if they would believe her, and she didn't know if she believed herself. One evening, as she walked back from the grocery store, Charlotte had a strange feeling that something was following her. It was an odd sensation, one she couldn't explain, but it was there, just beyond the edge of her awareness. She quickened her pace, glancing over her shoulder every few steps, but there was nothing behind her. The street was empty, save for a few cars parked along the curb. Still, the feeling persisted. It felt like the shadows themselves were moving, bending toward her. It was as though the world was watching her, waiting for her to break. By the time she reached her apartment, her heart was racing. She fumbled with her keys, nearly dropping them as she tried to unlock the door. When she stepped inside, she immediately felt the weight of the air around her. The apartment felt wrong. It was as though it had changed in the brief time she had been outside. The familiar creaks of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, all seemed muted, distant. And then, just as she was about to close the door behind her, she heard it, the faintest sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the other side of the apartment. Her heart skipped a beat. She stood frozen, listening. The footsteps grew louder, closer. They were coming from the hallway, the same hallway that led to the back room. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. The air around her seemed to thicken, suffocating her. Her mind raced with panic as she tried to convince herself that it was just the building settling. It had to be. But deep down, she knew. She knew that there was something else in the apartment, something that shouldn't be there. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, as though whatever was making them was pacing back and forth, waiting for something, waiting for her. Finally, with a burst of courage, Charlotte rushed into the living room, her breath ragged in her chest. She stood there for a moment, trying to calm herself. It was just the old apartment. It was nothing. But as she turned toward the hallway, she saw it. The door to the back room was open, just a crack. The darkness beyond the door seemed to swallow up the light from the living room. The air felt colder now, sharper. She could hear the faint whispering again, like 1,000 voices murmuring just out of reach. With trembling hands, Charlotte closed the door to the back room. She didn't know why she did it, perhaps to stop the darkness from creeping into her life, or perhaps because she knew that the room was the source of whatever had begun to haunt her. She locked the door, though she knew it wouldn't stop what was coming. The footsteps had stopped, but Charlotte didn't feel any relief. It was as though the silence itself had turned against her, pressing down on her with a weight she couldn't escape. That night, she didn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the inevitable. The hours stretched on, each minute dragging her further into a state of panic. The whispering seemed to echo through the walls, louder now, more distinct. The voices were calling her, urging her to come closer, to enter the room, to face whatever was waiting for her inside. The darkness in the apartment was alive, crawling into every corner, every crack in the walls. Charlotte could feel it pressing against her, suffocating her, consuming her. She could no longer tell where the apartment ended and where her mind began. The two had become one, indistinguishable, a tangled mess of fear and confusion. And then, in the dead of the night, the walls began to move. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, like the shift of an old building settling into itself. But then it grew louder, more violent. The walls creaked and groaned as though they were alive, stretching and bending, pushing inward. Charlotte's breath caught in her throat as she realized what was happening. The apartment was shrinking. The room around her was closing in, getting smaller with each passing second. Her heart pounded in her chest as she scrambled out of bed, her hands slick with sweat. She ran to the door, trying to escape, but it was too late. The walls were closing in on her, pressing her toward the center of the room. She screamed, but the sound was muffled, swallowed by the shifting walls. The apartment had become a cage, a trap from which there was no escape. The walls continued to move, grinding against each other, closing off every possible exit. Charlotte felt her body being pushed, her limbs forced together by the constricting space. The air was thick, suffocating, and she could feel her lungs tightening, her heart struggling to keep up with the pressure. And then, as the walls closed in completely, she felt a final, overwhelming wave of terror wash over her. The apartment was no longer a home. It was a prison, and she was its prisoner. The last thing she felt before everything went black was the cold, unyielding embrace of the walls, closing her in, trapping her forever. The silence that followed was deafening. It felt like hours, days, maybe even weeks, before Charlotte could hear anything again. Her mind was a blur of confusion, but one thing was undeniable. She was awake. It had to be a dream, she told herself. It had to be. The crushing walls, the suffocating darkness, they were all part of some terrible nightmare. But as she blinked her eyes open, the first thing she noticed was the distinct lack of the walls closing in around her. Instead, she felt the sharp sting of cold air on her skin, the kind that only comes with a room that's been abandoned for years. Her breath hitched. She slowly pushed herself up from the floor, her legs unsteady as if she hadn't moved in days. The air around her was stale, the kind of musty, damp air that filled forgotten, rotting spaces. She looked around, squinting through the darkness, trying to make sense of her surroundings. The room was unfamiliar, long, narrow, with high ceilings that stretched far above her head. The stone walls were covered in damp, discolored patches, and the floor was rough, uneven, like it hadn't been walked on in ages. Charlotte's heart raced as she stood there, trying to piece together what had happened. The room felt wrong. It was as though she had slipped through some sort of veil, stepping into a space that had never been meant for the living. The faint echoes of something distant, something deep beneath the stone, reverberated through the air, filling her ears with whispers, whispers of voices long lost to time. Her eyes darted to the far end of the room, where a faint glow flickered in the distance. It was almost imperceptible at first, like the softest hint of light in the blackness. But as she approached, The glow grew stronger, revealing a small weathered door embedded in the far wall. The air around it seemed to hum, charged with an unseen energy. It beckoned to her. Without thinking, Charlotte moved toward the door, her steps slow and cautious. Her hand trembled as it reached for the handle, a cold metal bar that seemed to pulse with an energy of its own. The moment her fingers made contact, a jolt of electricity shot through her, and the door creaked open on its own as if inviting her in. Inside, there was a room unlike any she had ever seen. It was vast, larger than the entire apartment, and filled with intricate carvings and symbols etched into the stone walls. The air was thick with dust, yet the room exuded an ancient presence, a power that radiated from the very stones that made up its foundation. Charlotte stepped forward, drawn by the strange energy that seemed to pull her in, but the moment she crossed the threshold, a sharp, unbearable pain shot through her head. She stumbled back, clutching her temples, her knees buckling as the room spun around her. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, until they felt like they were inside her head, crawling under her skin, prying open her mind. She could hear them now, not just the faint murmurs, but actual words. They were calling her name, beckoning her deeper into the room, urging her to listen. "Charlotte," the voices whispered. "Charlotte, come closer." Her breath came in shallow gasps. She tried to back away, to flee from whatever it was that was inside the room, but her body felt paralyzed, as if some unseen force had a hold on her. She could feel it now, the presence that had been following her for weeks, the malevolent force that had begun with the whispers in the walls and the shadowy figure in the back room. It was here, in this space, and it wanted something from her. As the voices continued to pull at her, Charlotte's mind began to unravel. The walls, the ceiling, the very air around her seemed to warp and shift, distorting her perception of time and space. She felt as though she were being pulled into a different reality, a place where the rules of the physical world no longer applied. It was as though the apartment itself was nothing more than a doorway, a threshold into something much darker, much older. She reached out, her hand trembling as she touched the nearest wall. The moment her fingers made contact with the cold stone, a sharp, stinging sensation shot up her arm, making her cry out in pain. She withdrew her hand quickly, but it was too late. The walls had already begun to shift, pulling her in, suffocating her. It was at that moment that she understood. The apartment wasn't just a building. It was a living thing, a creature that had been feeding off her fear, off the energy of her confusion and terror. The room, the back room, had been a doorway, a trap, luring her into its grasp. And now it was feeding on her completely, drawing her deeper and deeper into its web of madness. As the last of her strength drained away, Charlotte heard a voice. It wasn't one of the whispers. It wasn't the dark force that had been haunting her. It was something else, something familiar. "Charlotte." She turned toward the sound, her heart thundering in her chest. Standing before her, silhouetted against the darkened doorway, was a figure. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, his face obscured by shadow. But there was something about him that made her feel safe, as if his presence was the only thing keeping her grounded. "Who are you?" Charlotte gasped, her voice barely a whisper. "What is this place?" The man took a step forward, and Charlotte could see the faint glimmer of his eyes in the dark. His expression was unreadable, But there was a quiet strength in him, a presence that seemed to push back against the dark energy that had taken hold of the room. "It's not real," he said softly. "None of this is real." Charlotte stared at him, her mind spinning. What did he mean? How could this not be real? The pain, the fear, the suffocating darkness. It all felt so tangible, so real. But the man was right. This was a place beyond reality, a place that existed outside of time and space. It was a trap, a manifestation of the horrors that had taken root in her mind, and it had been waiting for her. "But I don't understand," Charlotte whispered, her voice trembling. "How do I get out?" The man's eyes softened, and he extended his hand toward her. "You'll have to let go," he said. "Let go of the fear. Let go of the darkness. Only then will you be free." Charlotte's breath caught in her throat as she looked at his outstretched hand. She was terrified, terrified of what might happen, terrified of what she might find in the shadows. But she knew deep down that this was her only chance. With a trembling hand, she reached out and took his hand. The moment their fingers touched, the room seemed to explode. The walls cracked and splintered, the floor buckling beneath them as the dark energy shattered, dissipating into the void. Charlotte gasped, her body shaking as the oppressive weight that had held her down for so long lifted from her chest. In that instant, she felt light, weightless, as if she were floating above the world. The whispers, the darkness, the twisted reality that had surrounded her for so long all vanished in the blink of an eye. She was free, but even as the room collapsed around her, even as the darkness receded into nothingness, one thing remained, a single fading whisper so faint that it almost seemed like a memory. "Charlotte." And then everything went dark. When Charlotte awoke, she was lying on the floor of her apartment, the familiar creaky wooden floors beneath her. The smell of dust and age lingered in the air, but it wasn't the same. It was lighter, fresher. The oppressive weight that had once filled the apartment was gone. She slowly pushed herself up, looking around as if unsure that she had really escaped. The back room was silent now. The door was closed, the latch secured. For the first time in what felt like forever, the apartment felt like a home again, quiet, safe, and completely ordinary. But as Charlotte rose to her feet, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The air felt different, as though the very essence of the apartment had been reset, restored. She stood there for a long time, her heart still racing, her breath still unsteady. And then, as she walked toward the door, she glanced back at the corner of the room. For just a moment, she thought she saw something, just a fleeting shadow standing in the corner of the room. But when she turned, there was nothing there. The apartment was silent once again, and this time, Charlotte felt no fear. The story was over. The nightmare had ended.